Hi friends, if you've seen my previous videos, welcome back. If not, welcome to my channel. I am a first year medical student at the University of Oxford and I'm using this channel to share my experience as well as advice for anyone who's applying. So something that's quite special about me is that I'm an international student. I'm from Singapore, so I'm not from the UK originally, which means that it's quite a different pathway for me, and that is why I want to share my experience so that more international students can know what it's like, or even people who are applying from the UK, they can have a different they can see my experience from a different perspective, especially if you're applying to medical school or if you're considering applying to Oxford or even Cambridge. The application process is quite similar, so I'm hoping that you can learn something from this video and from my other videos as well. So today I will be sharing my interview experience, which was from December last year, and I'm hoping that by sharing my experience you can have an idea of what to expect. So Oxbridge interviews for medicine are quite different, they are quite unique. They are traditional panel interviews, so they are not MMIs or multiple mini interviews, which many medical schools do nowadays. Oxford doesn't do that. Oxbridge don't do that, so instead they still do traditional panel interviews, which means that you go in, there will be 2 to 3 interviewers and they will just ask you questions and you have to answer them. However, they are also not really like normal panel interviews in the sense that they tend to be a lot more academic. They tend to be a lot more of academic discussions rather than just, general questions about yourself and stuff like that. They tend to be a lot more science-based or academically focused in that sense. You usually receive your interview invitations around end of November, and then your actual interviews will be about mid-December. So mine was around the 15th to 16th, I think, or was it 16 to 17? Anyway, it will be across 2 days. So usually you'll be interviewed at 2 colleges. One college is the one that you indicated as your choice on UCAS, and the other one is randomly allocated. So I was allocated to Pembroke, and the college that I actually chose was Exeter, so I stayed at Pembroke, but I interviewed at both Pembroke and Exeter. So many people ask me how long do you need to prepare for the interviews. I would say that 2 weeks was enough for me. So I started preparing around early December, from the time my exams ended to the time of the interview, which was slightly less than 2 weeks. But because I had all the time to devote to it, so I didn't have school during that 2 weeks, which meant that it was enough time for me. I think for most people 2 weeks would be more than enough. Even if you still have school during that time, 2 weeks is enough. So I would say you can just start preparing from the time that you receive the interview invitation, and you should be fine in terms of that. So I will start with my first interview. My first interview is at Pembroke. My first 2 interviews were at Pembroke, so they were kind of one after the other. There was a bit of waiting time in between because we have to rotate between different people, and basically there are 2 different rooms with 2 separate interviews, and then you're rotating with someone else. So I was rotating with 4 other people, and then basically they will get through all of us, but within that afternoon. And my first interview was a lot based on ethics. There were ethical scenarios that I had to comment on and stuff like that. So they didn't immediately jump into the interview. They started with a kind of warm-up question about my personal statement. So I think usually maybe the first question is like a warm-up question. So mine was about my volunteering at the hospice, which was quite easy to talk about because I've prepared for it. I wrote about it in my personal statement, and I was very confident to talk about it because I had prepared my answer. Of course, you don't want to sound very scripted, so even when you prepare, when you are preparing for the interviews, try to put them in bullet points instead of a whole paragraph, and you shouldn't memorize word for word because they can tell when it's scripted. Right, you don't want to sound like you are reading from a script. And then after that, there was a lot of ethics involved in the first interview. So the first interview, there were 2 interviewers, so they just took turns basically asking questions, and I just remember it as a very ethics kind of interview. At the end, one of the interviewers also asked me about the NHS. So the NHS is the National Health Service in the UK. It is basically the UK's healthcare system. And I was a bit shocked when they first asked me about it because I'm not originally from the UK, so I do not actually have personal experience with the NHS, and it can be quite difficult for like an international student to answer questions about the NHS, but I would say that it was okay for me because I read up about it beforehand. So I would recommend, especially if you're an international student, to read up about the healthcare system in the UK, to read up about the NHS, because it is very unique, it is very special to the UK, and you may get asked about it in your interviews. So I think the first interview went relatively alright, except for one of the questions that I couldn't really answer, which was about an advance directive. So because he gave me some scenario about someone who perhaps I think had dementia or something like that, basically he was trying to ask me, what factors do we have to consider? So in such cases, when a patient has perhaps like dementia or a mental health problem, you have to consider their competence and their capacity. Like you have to assess whether they're competent enough to make decisions for themselves. And the thing is that he asked me, are there any alternatives to, rather than just asking him to make the decision on the spot, are there any alternatives? And I couldn't really answer that question. So what he was looking for was this thing called an advance directive, which is basically like a living will. It's something that, someone writes before they are diagnosed with a medical condition. They write, if this thing happens to me, I would want something. So for example, you can write that if I ever fall into a coma or I have to rely on a ventilator, I want it to be removed. There are this kind of advanced directives and this kind of concepts in place that you kind of should familiarize yourself with, because if you like me could not answer that simple question, it's actually considered a very simple question because it's like a concept that you should know about. If you can't answer those kind of questions, it will kind of reflect a bit badly on you. So I thought that the first interview was like alright, except for that one thing that made it not so good. So for my second interview, it was still at Pembroke, so I had some waiting time in between, and then I went into my second interview. That one was a lot more sciencey. It was very much focused on science. So there were also two interviewers at this interview. The first interviewer asked me some questions about the brain, and I think he was kind of just trying to test my knowledge about medicine in general and my interest in medicine, and like whether I had read up about medicine outside of what I'm learning in school. And there was quite a lot of back and forth, so it felt more like a discussion rather than just me answering the question. So he will ask follow-up questions and he will stop me, he will interrupt me and interject, so it was a lot more like a discussion. And he also showed me an x-ray and asked me to identify some parts of the x-ray, as well as there was like a tumor in the shoulder, I think. Yeah, so he wanted me to kind of be able to recognize some of the signs and kind of guess what they were. And there was also some stain or fluid that they used to stain different parts of the x-ray, and he kind of tried to guide me along and tried to make me come up with the answers to what it shows. So it actually showed glucose, but I couldn't get the answer on my own because I have never been exposed to that kind of technique before. So the thing about Oxford interviews is that they can ask you about something that you've never ever heard of or learned of before, and that is the whole point of it. They are intentionally doing it to challenge you. They want to see how you respond to something that you've never encountered before, and how you can think on your feet and how you can respond and think critically. So I think that was quite challenging for me. I kind of stammered and stuttered, and I was very unsure of the answers, but the thing is that they will guide you. So do not get flustered even if you cannot get the correct answer the first time. The point is not to get the correct answer the first time. The point is not to immediately know the answer, because if you already know the answer, they won't bother asking you. They won't bother asking you about A-level knowledge because they know that you know it, and then it would just be pointless to ask you about it. So they want to see how you work your way through a problem, your thought process. So it's very important to voice out your thought process even if you don't know the correct answer. The other interviewer also asked me, he showed me a graph regarding birth weights and something like the relationship between famine during pregnancy and birth weights in newborns. I think it's kind of related to this famous experiment, but I didn't know about it before, so I've never heard about it before going for the interview. And of course that's completely normal because I have not read up enough to know about this supposedly famous experiment, but I did know about epigenetics, so luckily I was able to kind of link it to epigenetics, which is kind of related to that experiment. Of course, I'm not going to go in detail into what it was about because I don't think they will ask you the same question ever again. It's very unlikely, so you will probably get a totally different scenario. But I'm just saying that they can show you graphs and ask you to describe and analyze and ask you what can you infer from this data. And then there was also a part about experimental design, so it was kind of related to the graph that he showed me, and then he wanted me to design an experiment to test something else. So it was kind of related, but it was kind of like a new aim for the experiment that I have to design. So the point that I'm trying to bring across here is that experimental design is also a very significant part of Oxford Medicine interviews. They tend to ask you in at least one of your interviews to design an experiment. So you have to be prepared to know what are the important ways that you can design experiments. And I think that you could have gained this through your science, your basic science knowledge, as well as perhaps reading beyond the syllabus. If you've read some biomedical science related books, many of these books actually describe experiments and experimental design. It can be very helpful to know about these things and what are the kind of factors that you have to consider when you're designing an experiment. So when I was preparing for the interview, I also went through a few practice questions about experimental design. Of course, they were completely different experiments from the ones that I was asked, but it kind of helps you if you think about what are the things that you need to consider when designing an experiment. Like if you've thought about it before, it will be much easier for you during the actual interview for you to come up with a reasonable experiment. So that was the main stuff that happened during my second interview. I would say that I wasn't pleased with that at all. I couldn't answer a lot of the questions, and I thought that I totally failed that interview. I think they really push you really a lot in terms of the science, because you wouldn't have been exposed to the scientific concepts before. You wouldn't have been exposed to those experiments before, and they just throw those things at you and expect you to kind of come up with a reasonable conjecture or a reasonable hypothesis, which to me was really difficult, and I feel that I didn't do well in that interview at all. Now moving on to my Exeter interviews. So they were on the next day. Basically, I had to stay overnight at Pembroke, and then the next day I walked to Exeter in the morning for my other two interviews, which were both at Exeter. So again, it's like you're rotating with other people, so it will both be in the morning, but there will be some waiting time between the two. So unlike at Pembroke, at Exeter there were 3 interviewers for each interview. For my first interview at Exeter, there was also a lot of science. It was quite sciencey based and quite academic in a sense. They started off as well asking me a question about my hospice volunteering from my personal statement. So it was very similar to my first interview at Pembroke, my first question. So I think they like to ask about your work experience, or they like to ask about your volunteering experience. I think maybe it's because I wrote about it in my personal statement, but basically I'm saying that you can prepare for these kinds of general questions, even though honestly it's just a warm-up question for Oxford. That is not their main focus, but it helps to get you off to a good start. It helps to boost your confidence if you can start off well with something that you've prepared, that you've thought of before. So I basically just talked about relatively the same thing. After that, one of the interviewers showed me a graph again. So they always show us graphs. I had graphs at every single one of my interviews. So it's very important that you know how to interpret graphs and describe them and say what you can infer from them. So yeah, the interviewer gave me a graph about something about the relationship between smoking and e-cigarettes and something like that, how different factors affect, I think, something along those lines. I can't remember exactly now, but then the main thing that she wanted to ask me was to design an experiment. So again, there's this experimental design component that keeps coming up. So I would say that you should prepare for it. I mean, you should be mentally prepared at least that you have to design experiments in your interviews. And if she wanted me to kind of evaluate the effect of e-cigarettes on smoking or something like that, something similar to that. Basically for this experimental design, it was a lot more important for me to establish the different groups that I want to put the participants into. So I had to have a control group and experimental group. But then that wasn't good enough for her, so she asked me a follow-up question. What if it's the action of smoking instead of inhaling the smoke itself that affects addiction and stuff like that? So then I suddenly thought of, oh, you know, you can use a placebo, or you can use like a third group. So there's this very important concept in scientific experiments called placebo, the placebo effect. So if you've never heard of it before, I really suggest that you read up on it. It basically means that because someone who is given a drug, even if it's inactive, they can have a reaction to it just because of the psychological effects of taking that drug. Anyway, you should read up more about this placebo effect and why scientific experiments or clinical trials tend to use a placebo group. This is very important for you to know in case they ask you to design an experiment or a clinical trial. And then the next interviewer, he gave me like this scenario about poisonous darts, and then he kind of was asking me about how would this affect the muscles and paralysis of the muscles and stuff like that. So Of course, they will allow me some time to think and answer first before they ask me to go further. So I think that this actually might have been my best interview. Why? Because the interviewers were very encouraging. They kept nodding at my answers, which made me feel like my answers were correct, which made me feel like my answers made sense. Although the questions were really difficult, like I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but the interviewers were nodding, and I think this was the only interview that I saw them smile. And then my last interview, which is my fourth interview or my second interview at Exeter, it also had 3 interviewers. And for this interview, something a bit different is that we were given an article to read. So we were given about 5 to 10 minutes before the interview to read an article. And of course, you don't have any access to any devices. You can't annotate the article or anything. It's just for you to read. It's like 2 pages, so like 2 sides of an A4. And you basically just have to read. So my article was about this vaccine which has some side effects. So it was about a vaccine to some virus. So basically I would have expected them to talk about the article when I went in, but that wasn't the case. So unfortunately they didn't start with the article, which I think was quite surprising for me, and I was quite taken aback because I had just read the article and I was fully prepared to just start talking about it the moment I walked into the interview room. But because they started with other questions, so I was so scared that what I remember from the article will start to fade from my mind, and I was so scared that they will ask me to summarize the article sometime later in the interview and I won't be able to do that. But anyway, they started with, I think, a general question again about what is the advantage or the disadvantages of the Oxford course, which is preclinical and clinical, like it's split into preclinical and clinical, compared to other types of courses like integrated courses. So this question I think was quite unexpected for me, but I kind of just compared, very logically thinking, what are the advantages of the course being clinical and preclinical versus an integrated course in other schools and stuff like that. So there are definitely both advantages and disadvantages. I think a bit more of like a normal question that you might get asked in other medical school interviews as well. And then after that came the more serious part. I think one of the interviewers showed me this piece of paper with loads of data on it again. It was kind of like a table, but it was a very convoluted table and it was very hard to read. And then he asked me to plot a graph based on that table. It was about a pedometer. You know, pedometer is like a step tracker kind of thing. It tracks the number of steps you walk. There were some different groups of people, I think, who were using it for different lengths of time, and I had to plot a graph. So the problem with having to plot a graph on the spot is that it's really, really scary. I don't know whether I'm doing it correctly or not, and you can't hesitate for too long because I didn't want to hesitate for too long. So I just picked up the pen and I just drew a normal graph that I would have plotted in school if I was doing this. So you just have to kind of explain your graph while you're drawing as well. You can't stay silent, so you should be explaining as you are drawing. You should be telling the interviewer, oh, why am I drawing this? What am I representing by drawing this? And those kind of stuff. So they really, really want to hear your thought process. You have to vocalize your thought process throughout the entire interview. In like the middle of the interview or something, we finally got to the part that was related to the article, which is actually a role play. So it's quite different from what I expected as well. Instead of asking me questions about the article or what I thought of the article, we did a role play. So basically I was the doctor and the interviewer was the mother of a child who will be taking the vaccine, and she is basically having a lot of concerns about this vaccine. Basically it was quite scary because she was good at acting. She had a very scary expression, like a patient who is angry or demanding will be towards the doctor. It can be a bit intimidating if you've never experienced it before. If you've never experienced someone being angry at you or a patient being very demanding towards you, it can be quite intimidating. But for me, because I just try to smile. When I'm nervous or when I feel like I'm going to be intimidated by someone, I would just smile and I would just try to slowly explain things to them. So the important thing I think is that you shouldn't be reading from the article. We had the article in front of us on the table, but I didn't want to look at it. I did glance down maybe once or twice, but I didn't want to look at the article because I want to look at the patient. I want to pretend, I want to act like I am the doctor, that I actually know what I'm doing, because since I was given time to read the article beforehand, and I want to maintain eye contact with the patient. I want to seem like I am in control of the situation, that kind of thing. So yeah, even though Oxford doesn't do MMIs, it doesn't mean they won't do role play. It doesn't mean that they won't have a component of acting, which I think is quite interesting and actually quite useful as well for them to assess you, because if they don't do MMIs, then they can't really know how you will respond in different situations. So sometimes they'll still do an acting or role play in the interview itself just to assess how you will respond. And then lastly, the interview kind of ended off with some questions about genetic testing kits, those kind of stuff. So yeah, it's back to a bit of the science plus ethics. So it was kind of like, I think the last interview was the most diverse. It was really a combination of everything. It was a combination of acting, role playing, ethical scenarios, as well as science itself, and the relationship between health and society. It was very, very diverse. So just to quickly sum things up, those were my 4 interviews. The first 2 were at Pembroke, the second 2 were at Exeter. My first interview was very much about ethics and the NHS. My second interview was a lot about science, graph analysis, experimental design. My third interview was also a lot about science. So again, experimental design, analyzing graphs. My last interview was the most diverse. It did have kind of a societal health aspect to it, as well as role playing and ethical implications. So I think that after hearing this experience, perhaps you would think that, whoa, that's a lot to take in. Yes, it is a lot. So I think that this year, however, this year meaning 2020, it will be very different because the interviews are going to be online, and I think they're going to cut down on the number of interviews that they conduct, which I think is a pity because it will be much harder actually for them to assess suitable candidates. It'll be harder for them to differentiate, but normally, so if you're not applying in 2020, like let's say this goes back to normal in the future, normally you will have about 4 interviews, 2 at each college, and normally they will ask a range of questions, a wide range of questions, although a lot of them will be academic or a lot of them will be scientific related. So in conclusion, I just kind of want to end off with some quick tips, although I might do a separate video for that, but I just want to end off with the most important tips. So my first tip for the actual interview is to voice out your thought process, to think aloud. This is what everyone has said, everyone who has gone for Oxbridge interviews has said, because if you don't speak your thought process, no one's going to know what you're thinking. And even if you don't know the correct answer, you should just speak out your thought process. Even if you're not sure, just give it a guess, and then just explain why you think this might be so, and don't be scared to make mistakes. So I think the second point would be, don't be scared to make mistakes, because I think many candidates, they get nervous or they get flustered when they can't answer the questions, but they are not looking for the correct answer. As I said, they are looking for how you get to the answer, or what is your thought process as you think through this scenario or this challenging problem. The third thing is that in terms of preparation, I think you should definitely try to talk to yourself or do a mock interview with someone if they're willing to do for you. If not, just talk to yourself like what I did. And you can look up some past Oxbridge questions. I will also link my blog post in which I kind of listed all the questions that I could remember that I was asked, in case you want to check it out. It has what I can remember basically, and there are lists of Oxbridge questions online which you can kind of respond to, although I would say that the actual interview will be very different. They will never ask the same questions that have been put online. So be prepared that you won't get asked the same questions, but the point of preparing or the point of practicing before going for the interview is not to know the answers beforehand. It's to practice your thinking process. It's really to practice your thinking process, because you will be asked questions that you will never ever in your life have expected. They are very creative. They are very interesting. You won't be able to know or expect it beforehand. You will be taken aback, definitely, but it's fine. You just have to keep your cool and just give it your best shot. So last thing of all that I want to say is enjoy yourself. Really, it's an amazing experience. It's a once in a lifetime experience. Even though I was so scared, I enjoyed every single moment of all 4 of my interviews. So all the best to all of you who are applying, and as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to comment or to contact me, and see you in the next video.